I've got some news I want to discuss. It's right here on the cover of the Inquirer. Spies, lies, and betrayal.
Oh, wow.
And on there's an article all about Donald Trump and what he's planning on doing. Donald Trump is unmasked. The true Donald Trump is being revealed.
The reptilian face underneath.
Yeah, and it says that Trump has plans to get his revenge. According to this, he's going to target Tinseltown enemies, including George Clooney, Cher, Whoopi Goldberg, Robert De Niro, and even the screen siren Sharon Stone. Remember her?
Yeah, no, she's a little bit Trump derangement syndrome. Yeah, aren't the National Enquirer people his friends?
They were, but now they have to figure out a way to sell papers.
No, I mean maybe they are saying so as his friends.
Right. Maybe they are.
So I will say the news that I am most happy about is Kash Patel.
All right, well, welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. It's that time of the month where we talk to the last Marxist track coach, genius, Chris Cutrone. And Chris, thank you for continuing to participate in this wild experience and experiment called the Cutrone Zone. This time we've decided, really spontaneously at the outset, to discuss you rather than discuss some essay you've written or a thought from critical theory or a Marxist concept or a bit of history. We're going to discuss you as a kind of important figure on the left. I'm going to admit that you've become an important figure on the left at the outset, and tell you I'm sort of jealous, and at the same time I don't in any way begrudge you that, or like on the one hand I'm jealous, on the other hand I'm like, thank God it's not me.
Yeah.
But yeah. Tell me, how do you think it has come to be that you have become an important figure, maybe a gadfly figure on the left, and why you are such a target?
Right. So, Platypus made me controversial in a way that I might not have otherwise been. But I think that starting Platypus, like starting a group, means something in terms of the left. It means that you're drawing a kind of inside-outside distinction, it's in-group, out-group dynamics. And that's been tricky to manage in Platypus itself. Probably what I underestimated was how that would affect me outside of Platypus. And, because I think what's been difficult, I was looking at a letter to the CPGB Weekly Worker by Ben Campbell, who is the ex-member who did the boycott letter against us in 2013 that was posted to Lenin's tomb, the Richard Seymour blog. He was following up. It's actually printed alongside a letter of mine on Platypus' position on anti-imperialism. And then his letter is Boycott the Host. And what he said was that Chris Cutrone puts himself in a position where it's impossible to debate him. And in other words, that I had done some ultimate power move vis-a-vis the left. By declaring the left dead, I had put myself outside of any kind of comradely discussion, any possibility of that. And therefore, Platypus is in bad faith, and therefore people should refuse to participate in Platypus. And, so boycott the host. And I just thought, okay, well, what is this really about? And you recently had a conversation that you'll be posting with Daniel Tutt where he referred to me as a contrarian. And he also made a similar complaint that by being a contrarian, I put myself in an unfair position outside of rational debate.
Yeah.
And I thought, right? And I thought,
yeah, I kind of remember him saying that, but that doesn't strike me as putting it that way. That doesn't strike me as making any sense.
It's not accurate.
Yeah, if you are a contrarian,
then
you're making an argument contrary to received opinion, but of course you can be debated. So
right.
Contrarians can be debated.
Of course.
But the Campbell claim seems a little different than that.
It is a little different, but they're related. Because I was thinking about, what's controversial about me is what's controversial about Platypus. So that's the other thing that people will do is that they'll say that Platypus is fine, but Chris Cutrone is a problem.
Yeah.
And you even did that at some point.
I did.
Right.
But that was, yeah.
So
I didn't say you were necessarily bad. I was even worse than that. I was like, even if he's fine, for the sake of optics, throw Chris Cutrone under the bus.
Optics, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
So what it boils down to is, look, there's nothing to debate about Platypus. That's the other thing that Ben Campbell was complaining about, is that because Platypus doesn't take any positions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's what's related to, because I think that Daniel Tutt was saying that by being a contrarian, I'm contrarian on everything. And you and I have had this dynamic also on the podcast where you've, noticed that I'm like a trickster. And I would just say no, and you mentioned like Gadfly.
Mm-hmm.
Socrates. It's the Socratic method. Right? And, and I am here to teach, and certainly on the Cutrone Zone I'm here to teach, in a way that's different from Platypus. So Platypus, I do more straightforward pedagogy in the reading group. I basically do as straight a reading of like Marx, Lenin, and Adorno as I think is possible.
Right.
And, but then Platypus only exists as an organization. It only has a membership in order to support a specific kind of activity, and that's hosting the conversation on the left, and specifically hosting the conversation on the death of the left. But, let's just call it hosting the conversation on the left, hosting the conversation that otherwise would not take place, and which doesn't take place. And therefore, we're doing a valuable service. And we are. And that's been recognized. But people get weird about it when they realize the price of that. Meaning, why are we so ecumenical? Why do we admit everybody? Why don't we, include some people but exclude other people? And that's because they're all equally dead. Meaning, and they're all equally a shard, a fragment, a memory of something. Right? So liberals and anarchists, socialists of all kinds, Marxists of all kinds, Maoists, Trotskyists, what have you, social democrats are each holding a piece of something that has disintegrated. And that was held together in a way that's difficult for us to reconstruct for ourselves in Second International Marxism. Meaning, we've talked about this, like why did the socialists in the United States have to start the ACLU and the NAACP? Why were they involved in the formation of women's suffragist organizations? Because it fell to the socialists to be the liberals. And I think it's very hard for people to understand how the Marxists navigated that period of history in such a way as to really eclipse all the other socialist tendencies and take the initiative in a lot of liberal politics. And, of course, that's what I think we have to get back to. Right? But in the meantime, we've had, like, the Cold War liberalism, the split in Marxism, social democrats versus communists, socialists versus communists, left comms versus Stalinists, anarchists. It's fallen apart. The whole thing's fallen apart. And so, but it's all led to the same dead end, right? So it's fallen apart, and all the various parts have all ended up in the same dead end.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, we can afford to entertain all that stuff. It's not like oh, we have to exclude the Stalinists otherwise, right? Or we have to exclude the anarchists otherwise they're just going to launch a Kronstadt revolt. You know, like, no, like, it's just not, like, none of this is like an urgent matter, really, ideologically on the left. None of it's an urgent matter. It's all more or less brain rot, all of it. You know, like, I'm a Frankfurt School scholar. Can I tell you, Frankfurt School scholarship, brain rot. It's brain rot. Why? Not because, like, I'm better. It's because I don't ignore the obvious, which is that they're Marxists. All the Frankfurt School scholarship is how they're really theologians, and it's just crap, right? And so, and that's the way it is with all the tendencies on the left. You know, they're all mockeries of where they come from, historically. Like the anarchists are a mockery of historical anarchism.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, it's all a mockery. You know, it's like, you know, I'd love to say that Bhaskar Sankara is Eduard Bernstein, but he's not. It's a mockery of Bernstein. It's not even Bernstein.
Well, it's not fair to make that comparison.
I guess. Why not? Why don't you think it's fair?
Because Bernstein was coming up during a living revolutionary struggle where he had the foundation of a working class that was politically organized.
Right.
And he was operating within that milieu. And,
right.
You know, Bhaskar came up after the complete devastation of all of that and the devastation much more.
It's unfair for me to hold Bhaskar to that standard. It is. I'm not, and I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to say, let's be real about ourselves. Meaning, like, I'm not going to claim that I can be an Adorno.
Right.
You know, I just don't have
that one's hard as a novelist. That one's hard for me to, at first blush, take in, because I just feel like, oh, well, the way you become an Adorno is you sit down and you read and you think and you write and then you say things that are true. And the more true the things are that you're saying and the more you develop your style, the more you become like Adorno. But that's the way you end up, I guess, in this brain rot, right?
Yes.
Did you think that way?
Yeah, and it becomes a weird style, you know, that people imitate. It's very bizarre because, I mean, you know, one could say that about, you know, philosophy in general, is that it's deteriorated insofar as it's become distant from social and political struggle in reality.
Yeah, but I want to go back to a philosophical part of what you said before when you compared yourself to Socrates, right? And
well, Socrates is a funny one, isn't he? Because he's not Plato.
Well, I was just about to say.
Yeah.
Socrates, if you're taking the role of Socrates, he's always mediated through Plato.
Yeah.
Right? That's how you encounter him. And the arguments in the different dialogues don't always lead to a conclusion, but other than a destructive one for quite a while. But eventually, as the dialogues progress and as you read more, a positive philosophy, an explanation, an ontology emerges. But that is more Plato than it is Socrates himself. It is more Plato than it is Socrates, but all we ever get of Socrates, really, except for some plays, is through Plato. And so the way that these dialogues are put together, it is directed towards this positive politics. And I think if you go back to the Ben Campbell complaint,
yes,
it would be that really Chris Cutrone is Plato, but he's pretending to be Socrates. He's hiding his
philosopher king. Yeah,
he's hiding his political project, and underneath a purely negative, destructive project, with the aim of eventually
being
like a Trojan horse coming forward with this new sectarian Marxism, which isn't actually different from all the other sectarian Marxism.
Yeah, in its basic claims. No, so there's another analogy. So Martin Scorsese is doing a series for Fox Nation, the streaming service, on the Saints, right? And he's got some Christian victim of the Holocaust. I'm not sure who that is, who's been beatified. And then he's got Joan of Arc. He's got John the Baptist. And one more. There are four. Maybe Saint Sebastian. I'm not sure. But John the Baptist. John the Baptist. So get ready for this, Doug. Children, I'm not Jesus, but I am John the Baptist. I am John the Baptist. And, and I'm Christopher. I'm Saint Christopher, carry Jesus across the water. So, bearer of Christ. That's what Christopher means.
Mm-hmm.
But John the Baptist. And, I didn't start out thinking of myself that way, but there was an article written in a German newspaper about Platypus a number of years ago by a guy, Misha Brumlik, where he said Chris Cutrone is like the John the Baptist of a new Marxism that he hopes will emerge. And he's a liberal guy. I think he's he's familiar with leftism. He might be an ex-leftist. He's baby boomer age, I think, or maybe he's in between like our generation and the baby boomers. He has a column called like God and World. And this is one of his columns, was he decided to write a column about me.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, this Chris Cutrone, he calls himself the last Marxist, and he's interested in Lenin and Adorno.
Mm-hmm.
And what the hell is this, right? How do you make Lenin and Adorno come together? And, but then he said, you look at his blog, you look at the masthead of the blog, the last Marxist, Chris Cutrone is the last Marxist. And he's like, it's like the Chris Cutrone is the last Marxist is like amen to the prayer, right? So he drew the analogy to John the Baptist. And I thought, actually, that's good. If we're going to, do these religious analogies, if we're talking about cults, right? If I'm a cult leader, cult guru, and Platypus is my cult, so getting back to it, starting a group, having followers. Doug Henwood was complaining about being accosted by all the secretaries of Platypus on Facebook because he would, badmouth me, and then various Platypus members would comment, and they were disproportionately women, and he was freaked out by that, right? He was a typical sexist straight guy, has a hard time with women, has a hard time being contradicted by women, felt disarmed by it, and he's like, Chris Cutrone is unleashing his legion of cult followers, women, on me, right? And, so it was just obvious to everybody. I mean, certainly the Platypus members, how condescending he was being and how, misogynistic he was being, where basically it's like, well, the only people who would listen to Chris Cutrone uncritically would have to be women.
Well,
no, it wasn't that, Doug. And
really?
Yes, it was. Legions of secretaries. I have to deal with Chris Cutrone's.
I'll tell you what,
the
women, as a sexist straight guy, the women I trust and would be glad to argue with are people in Platypus, because because they don't. They don't argue from person so much, or from.
Right.
I know.
I know, definitely. In other words, it couldn't be further from the truth, and yet it's perceived this way. So let's lean into it, as they say. Right? Because I'm one, my motto since I started Platypus has been admit everything, concede nothing. Meaning I'll admit all the accusations against me, but I don't think that concedes anything.
So you'll admit you're a cult leader. You'll admit that you are using a Trojan horse in the form of Socrates to really unleash Platonism upon the world.
Well, look, Marxism, and of course Marxism, look, I think that we've talked about this. I certainly, I mentioned this in my book. For me, Marxism is only interesting. I've been doing it for all these years. Is only interesting for the questions and problems it raises. I don't think that Marxism really provides answers or solutions at this point. I think that we're very far from Marxism being, as my old comrades in the Spartacist League said, a guide to action. It's not a guide to action, because they say, Marxism is not a guide to thinking, it's a guide to action. And I'm like, actually, it's more a guide to thinking than it is a guide to action at this point. And it's a guide to thinking in what way? Via negativa. And that's really the other point to Platypus and my approach, is that it is like deliberately and rigorously negative, meaning not this, not that, not the other thing, not anarchism, not Stalinism, not social democracy, not Trotskyism. And don't try to be like an Adornian. What the hell would that be? It's not any of these things. Like everything that we have around us is just not a model to follow. But all are exemplary of a problem that we have to consider and that we have the luxury of considering because we're not in a position where there's any urgency of action. Because nothing that we do matters immediately to change fundamental things. All that would matter is, can we free ourselves of the dead hand of history?
You said something to me a while ago that when it comes to podcasting or being a pundit,
right,
and also when it comes to writing consistently
right,
for these kinds of publications like Compact or Unheard or Jacobin, even if you were ever to write for them, that one of your difficulties is you don't like to repeat yourself.
Yes.
Right? And what you just said is something you've said before, right? And it could easily enough have been turned into your stance that you could then try to make a kind of career out of. And what I noticed in early days of podcasting, really early days, like 2009, 2010, is that I would invite someone onto my podcast, and to check them out, I would listen to their interviews elsewhere, read some of their essays or articles. Maybe if they had a book, I'd read a part of the book or the whole book, and I would discover what their line of thought was. It was almost down to discovering what their routine was, what their jokes were, if they were comics, right? They have 10 minutes, and they do the same 10 minutes everywhere for 10 years or 20 years. Some comics used to do the same 15 minutes their entire careers, and so, but you resist that. But I think a lot of people want to put you into a slot so that they can say, here are Chris Cutrone's 15 minutes. We can compare them to the 15 minutes of Doug Henwood or 15 minutes of David Harvey. We can compare them to set fixed stances in this moment. And on the one hand, I think that is obviously so constraining as to be detrimental to thought. But on the other hand, I do understand the impulse, because you want to, everyone's limited in their attention. And so you want to be able to have a shorthand to understand what you're dealing with when you're dealing with the
Adorno called it the classificatory urge. The urge to classify everything. We could also call it pigeonholing. Right.
But in a political moment, that urge serves a political function, right? I'm thinking about in May of '68 when the students were occupying Nanterre, and they said, "We are purging all the Stalinists from our midst." Yeah. And they went through and they said, Maoist, the Stalinists, they just would, what organization are you with? What thinker do you represent? Get out.
Yeah, they were trying to out-Stalinists the Stalinists.
Right. And, but it seemed to serve a function in that moment to try to hold on to the direction they were trying to go in and not be sabotaged.
Right. Sure. No, right. I mean, it makes sense. At a certain level, it makes sense. But then, what did it actually gain them? Meaning, they were going to sabotage themselves. Meaning it's not like, we can't blame anybody for what's gone wrong with the left. I mean, this is one of my problems with like Rockhill and Lasordo is that, they want to show the culprits. They want to say, oh, the reason that the left has failed is because there have been these Trotskyists or whatever. And they basically think the Frankfurt School are Trotskyists. That's at the bottom of everything. And they are, of course. The Frankfurt School are, in many respects, Trotskyists. They are influenced by Trotsky, and
that's how you can say that Adorno is a Leninist.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. I mean, at the same time, they refused to join the Trotskyist groups, and they certainly refused Trotskyism later on after Trotsky's death. But basically, I mean, look, so people want to quickly classify people. They want friend-enemy distinctions, the Schmittian kind of politics. They want a positive orientation. They want good guys, bad guys. And what if there are no good guys? What if there are no good guys? What if there never were any good guys? Meaning, like, not only today, 2024, almost 2025, of course there are no good guys. But it just wasn't about good guys and bad guys in Lenin's time. Is Lenin a good guy or a bad guy? Irrelevant. I mean, really,
right.
Politics. We're talking about politics. And, it's like, were the peasants who were lynching their landlords good guys or bad guys? Meaning they didn't just lynch the landlords. They lynched the peasants who supported the landlords too.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like this is what people want. They want some kind of like communalist bloodletting. They want to purge the community. They want to get rid of the bad guys. And it's like, I'm sorry. We've been around long enough. We've read George Orwell. If you're out to get the bad guys, there will never be an end to it.
No, I agree with you there. But to try to find the rational kernel in this impulse, it's not just a Schmittian friend-enemy distinction, but around 2011, say, when the Occupy Wall Street movement was coming up and then passing away, there was a battle about how to be political in the face of the capitalist crisis. Okay? And there were some lines were drawn, and most of the people on the left stood on the side of what would become the Bernie Sanders movement later on. The fact that Obama got reelected was a symptom of that defeat at Occupy, right? So, but there were a few who seemed to be siding against that turn, although it was sometimes difficult to see who was who. But like, for instance, at my old guru, Andrew Kleinman was certainly siding against that turn towards social democracy and re-entering into the Democratic Party. And David Harvey would have seemed to be siding against that, but then switched.
Yeah.
And someone like Slavoj Žižek was, in his way, siding against that. And in reality, the Platypus Affiliated Society was siding against that.
Sure.
But without a positive stance. Like, Zizek had his Lacanian reasons, David Harvey had his interpretation of Marxism. Andrew Kleinman certainly had his interpretation of political economy and Marxism. It's the reason why.
Occupy is a difficult one, I would say, because, so the two founding moments of the millennial left, to my mind, are the War on Terror and the Great Recession.
Right.
And so the anti-war movement and Occupy Wall Street stand in for those two things. And, when we started out, we were critics of the anti-imperialism of the left. That's how we started out. And, but it's kind of like, did that make us anti-imperialists? Did it make us pro-imperialists? What did it make us? No, we were interested in how the anti-war movement was limiting itself. And
anti-imperialism is not the same thing as pro-imperialism. The negation of negation. Now, I'm just doing shit there, but
seriously, no. There is a difference, and yet we were neither of those things.
Okay,
right? In the same way that we're not like just anti-Trump or something. Right.
Yeah.
Or we're not like, I don't know what, anti-woke, anti-racist.
You're not anti-racist, and you're not anti-woke.
Well,
Although
there's
I'm
that
tempted,
too. Right.
I'm tempted by being anti-woke, and I am also tempted by being anti-racist, and
Sure.
I'm tempted to be anti-imperialist. I'm all these I like all of those categories. I think I'm all of those things. So you're not though. So
Why?
what is
So
it to be?
why? Because the basic ethic, like where I'm coming from, and I've had to explain this over the course of the past year with respect to Israel-Palestine, for example,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is that of course I'm sympathetic to the Palestinians. Of course I'm sympathetic to anti-imperialism and the anti-war movement. And of course I'm sympathetic to the anti-racists.
Mm-hmm.
But my criticism comes from my sympathy, meaning
Right.
I'm disappointed. Like what's wrong with Black Lives Matter is the disappointment of it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like it doesn't go far enough. Meaning I think that, of course I didn't want to see the millennial left fold into the Democratic Party via Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I thought the millennial left was great, but because I wanted to see them fail on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to see them reach their authentic limits, and they shied away from that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I wanted to see the best that they could be.
Derek Varn, during Occupy, I believe was a member of Platypus at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Immediately
he said,
after. So he came in, there were a bunch of people who joined during and in the immediate aftermath of Occupy.
and he was one of the immediate after. But anyway, during Occupy, he said, of course, the Occupy Wall Street movement will fail. What is consequential is how it fails.
Yeah.
And I'm worried it's going to fail in the wrong way.
Right.
In the wrong way. And I
cut itself
yeah.
short.
Right. But Walter Ben Michaels and Adolph Reed are anti-racists.
Yeah, they are.
They are, meaning that they have, I think the difference is maybe that they have a positive political project that they think they put in opposition to the anti-racist project. They define the anti-racist project as neoliberalism, as an ideology of the ruling elite.
And they think that social democracy is the answer to racism.
Right.
In other words, they think it's the better form of anti-racism.
Right. Yeah.
No.
But that doesn't make a lot of sense for either of them, but certainly not for Adolf, because Adolf was a critic of the New Deal and the social democratic turn as it's understood now. Social democracy now means embracing.
He's a critic, but he's also a defender, meaning there is an anti-racist opposition to the New Deal as white supremacist. And of course, Adolf defends the New Deal against that criticism.
Right.
And the reason that I say this is that, for me, we can't resolve it like class, race.
Yeah.
You should be class first, you should be race first, because what matters is the actual content of it. Meaning, it's not like class first is better than race first, because what does class first mean? What's the content of that? Right. And certainly historically, because really, I do agree with Adolf that we're stuck in a pre-1965, I almost said pre-1865, but certainly pre-1965 framework for dealing with racism, meaning we ignore the reality of everything that's happened since 1965. But let's look at the pre-1965 world, where you could have a black criticism of the labor movement and of social democracy more generally, and of the welfare state as a kind of institutionalized racism, because it was. But then of course with neoliberalism, it's like, oh shit, wait, we don't want that to disappear, even though it was the basis for kind of white supremacy, the welfare state. It was, certainly. And so, again, it's kind of like, well, what do you draw from that analysis of the welfare state as a form of institutional racism in the United States before 1965? before it became racially inclusive, right? And, that could lead to a more radical socialist perspective than just doubling down on the social democratic welfare state could.
Well, I mean,
Right?
my understanding of the way in which the New Deal was racist was that it was racist for political economic reasons, not directly for racial reasons. So they targeted sectors of the economy for exclusion, which were racialized sectors, but that was almost contingently the case.
You mean
right?
they had to do it for economic reasons, but they also had to do it for political reasons because they couldn't get the Dixiecrats to sign on for it otherwise.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, it's both.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not like, oh, if it made economic sense, then they would have been able to ignore the Dixiecrats. No, they wouldn't have been able to pass it without the Dixiecrats. So, and so it just so happened, but it was also understood, like Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR were like, yeah, of course we'd want to include more black people in this. Of course we would, because FDR was basically a Republican.
Right.
He was a Republican who hijacked the Democratic Party, right? He came in with Theodore Roosevelt's program, which otherwise the Democrats were not interested in. So, of course they were for civil rights. They were for black rights, the FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, but they were constrained by political realities. They had to be Democrats.
Yeah. Okay. So just to go back to what you just said, I don't disagree. And I already kind of knew that they were making a deal with the racist Democrats to get this through. However, by making that deal for political economic reasons, that meant that there was now an opening for that to change as a political economic basis for the decisions change.
That's right. To expand it through the Great Society, make the LBJ turn. Yeah.
As the economy recovered, then this policy could be
and
extended.
As the blacks entered the industrial workforce as opposed to just being house servants.
And agricultural.
And sharecroppers, agricultural workers. That's right. So as the South industrialized and as blacks moved north, then you could have a constituency for the civil rights movement, and things had to change. So whether that was intentional or not, that wasn't really intentional. That was more capitalism, meaning it just so happened. And of course, World War II, the mass participation of blacks in the military. I mean, there were many things that could go on, right? And so... But again, it's kind of like, I mean, one way of bringing it back around is, I'd like to say, in a way that's going to, not make sense to people, that Marxists have been on every side of every issue in the last 100 years. There have been pro-fascist Marxists, anti-fascist Marxists, pro-imperialist Marxists, anti-imperialist Marxists, pro-racist Marxists, anti-racist Marxists. There have been pro-feminist, anti-feminist, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, homophobic, homophilic Marxists. They've been on every side of every issue. And I can say that because there have been Marxists shooting at each other over every issue. I mean, in other words, it's been a bloodline has been drawn among Marxists on every issue. So Marxism is not going to resolve any of that. Right? There's a theoretical resolution to that. Other than in very broad terms that, wouldn't really answer anything. Meaning, we're for women's equality. Okay, whatever that means. Because the right will say that they're for women's equality too. They'll just differ over what it means.
And actually, determining which one is the right and which one is the left is all you're saying is this one is better than that one.
Yep.
And you say, that's all you're saying.
That's all you're saying. And of course, the bottom line, one reason to say that the left is dead, it's not the main reason, like as far as Platypus is concerned, or as far as my intellectual orientation is concerned. But one basic way is to say that the left is not at all independent of capitalist politics. and it's tailing after this or that capitalist politics. I mean, I was very struck recently. I was watching something with Eddie and Haas from the American Communist Party, and it really struck me how they struggle to tail the Republicans without tailing the Republicans, in the way that the left tails the Democrats but pretends that they're not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is just such a beautiful illumination of what goes on, but now we can see it the other way.
Right.
That seeing it around the Republicans with MAGA communism just is very clarifying.
Right.
They condemn Trump and whatever, but it's obvious that they're just tailing Trump. In the same way that the left condemns the Democrats, but it's just obvious that they're following them.
Well, I'm accused anyway. I don't know if you're ever accused of this. I know you have been. Actually, I know you have been of tailing Trump. So,
oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I would love to say Donald Trump is my leader. For what? In what? Like what? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, I mean, again, there's no movement. It's not like, it's like the MAGA communists are like, we need to be with the working class, and the working class is going towards Trump. And I'm like, that's not really true. Meaning there was some shift of the working class vote in the election. But generally the working class is passive. A lot of them didn't vote. And the fact that they vote this way or that way doesn't really tell us much about their ideological orientation or their openness to being organized in any particular way. It's
right.
Very shallow. It's not a gauge at all, right? But this is the thing. I mean, this is part of the brain rot, is that we think politics is whatever is happening in capitalist politics.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that we have no power or influence over that whatsoever, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because we're free and clear of it, meaning we are not responsible for it. It's not, this kind of red lib blackmail, like, what's your stance on Palestine? The point is, I don't really have much of a stance because I'm not in a position to.
Right.
I have my feelings. I have my, disgust. I have my sympathies. I have my horror. I have my sadness.
What about some thoughts? What about your speculation?
Some thoughts. Yeah, you know that I've shared my thoughts, and the thoughts are pretty schematic and like abstract. Like for instance, you were, and I'll bring this up if we ever have a conversation with Daniel Tutt, but, he was talking about the Lebanese communists that he met when he visited, and how they said that the Palestine question is not solvable without a regional transformation of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, Palestine is the key. And I thought, well, actually, that doesn't follow.
Right.
That does not follow.
Actually, it's the opposite of what they were saying.
Yes, it's the opposite of what they were saying.
They were saying, we can't solve Palestine's problems in Palestine. Iran has to take over the region or something else. Like, we have to, this is happening on a larger level. And he was reading that as, it will start in Palestine and that will transform everything else, which doesn't make any real sense. That's just cognitive bias.
It's like a kind of a symbolism, that it's a mistaking of like, just because the Palestinians exemplify everything that's wrong with the Middle East doesn't mean that they're the key to solving it.
Right. And when he said that, I had a hard time responding to it. Mm-hmm. Because I felt like what he was saying was a symptom of such a large bias that I didn't even want to touch it. I didn't want to.
Right.
Right. I was just like, okay, well, to take this apart would take another couple of hours, and I don't have either the immediate resources to really.
I mean, the student protesters, that I've encountered on the Palestine Solidarity Front, that their attitude is that, the way they put it is Palestine's on the front line of all the struggles of today, right? Like they're on the front line of ecological climate change struggle. They're like basically what they're facing, like everything that the Palestinians are facing is like, everything that's wrong with the world.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I'm sorry, that's not really how it works, and it is like a confusion of symbolism and practical strategy.
Totally. Yeah.
And I think that, but what makes it plausible to people is that in the Democratic Party, it seems to be the case that the Palestine issue lines people up. Right? That your corporate Democrats are more pro-Israel. It could appear that way. So it appears, right?
But that was one of the things I was trying to argue throughout this whole time is that no, it doesn't even split the Democrats.
It doesn't.
Okay? And,
let alone that way.
Right. It doesn't split the Democrats. The Democrats have a task of holding together a coalition, and they have to have representatives for each part of the coalition, and those representatives can hold a variety of views. But they're nonetheless
right.
Their task is ultimately to hold that coalition together.
Absolutely. That's right. That's the bottom line.
That's it. And
that's
so
the bottom line.
And for me, I did this video about artificial protests, it was called, and it was about the principle of artificial negativity, and then also I just looked at who was funding the different pro-Palestinian movements, and I looked back on the anti-apartheid movement and how it worked.
Yeah.
And what it ignored. And what it ignored was the end of the Cold War and the end of the conditions for the U.S. state to want to maintain apartheid. And and all of the anti-apartheid protests and movements and organizations were ultimately a way to give young people and the radical contingent within the Democratic Party a feeling of having participation in the party,
right?
Even as nothing was going to change,
right?
It was and then eventually, because of all of that, when things changed, the Democrats could step forward and say, "We are the party, the anti-apartheid party. We are the party that got this accomplished." But they didn't know how long that holding pattern was going to go on. It was just a matter of holding their voting base. It was manipulation.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So, getting back to it, this is why nobody likes us. Right? Because, we bring up impolite things at the cocktail party.
Right.
And this is what, like Rockhill can't understand, because he's just like, these Frankfurt School people and these critical theory professors, like, they can't break with the institutional structures of imperialism because it's paying their salary. And I'm like, yeah, but you can say that at the cocktail party.
Right.
You can't say what we're saying at the cocktail party.
Yeah. Why is that? Why is what I'm saying so verboten? Because it breaks with the Democrats, I guess.
It breaks with the Democrats. At the end of the day, that's the thing. But the question is, why does it break with the Democrats, and how does it break with the Democrats? Because it brings up things that they're just not interested in, and they're not interested in addressing. Meaning, no one, look, like I always say, it's not like there are anti-socialist people out there. It's not like there are anti-working class people out there. There are not. Not really. There's, I guess, sophisticated right-wingers who think of socialism in a particular way who are anti-socialist, but that's not really the point. The point is, people don't believe that socialism can work.
Right.
A, and B, people believe that the working class can't take over society, that it would be a disaster. And it wouldn't really happen. It would just be some new elite, and it would be some ideological bureaucracy.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly what people believe. And they're not wrong.
They're not wrong. They're not wrong, because the working class today is not in a condition to take over society, but it would have to be to get beyond capitalism, I think. And, and that's a hard one, because it's like, holy shit, what's that going to take? It's going to take a lot, Right. And because we're saying that, it's like, oh, what the fuck? And why are you telling us this? Are you insulting us, Because you're turning everything that we're doing into something irrelevant, Yeah, well, it is. I mean, in other words, it's very relevant in terms of capitalist politics and in terms of petty bourgeois jockeying. But it's
Yeah,
not
if you want to
relevant.
maintain this, if you're working as a socialist to maintain the core of these conditions and perpetuate them into the future, fine. And I think the honest social democrats would say, yeah, because I don't believe in the working class that every cook can govern, and because I don't believe that, socialism will lead to any good thing. Therefore, I am simply trying to get the better side of this system to have more power, and that's all I'm trying to do.
Right. I mean, basically, there's an easy way of putting that ideologically, and we'll follow through on things that I've been saying around the campaign for a socialist party, which is that what we're saying sounds like anarchism, and the Stalinists and the Social Democrats would say, well, that's anarchism, and they would mean something really negative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, no, that's what's necessary. That's what's good, right? And the problem is that anarchism doesn't go far enough, meaning it can't just be at that level. It can't remain at that level. It ultimately has to aim for state power, and of course that comes with the danger of a much more radical co-optation than anything that happens now.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning,
say more about that.
Once the working class is organized to be a political force, then of course it's much more susceptible, liable, and it's much more dangerous for it to be co-opted.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we're not dealing with the problem of working class co-optation today because there's nothing to co-opt.
Right.
When there is something that could be co-opted, then the danger of co-optation would be that much greater because the stakes would be so much higher.
Right.
I mean, there are theories, and I feel like the Marxist humanists skirt with this idea in terms of what you've been exposed to, which is that the social democracy, the Lassallean Workers' Party, created a worse form of capitalism in the 20th century. That state capitalism was like a worse form of capitalism because it was more integral, it was more, totalitarian, etc. And one could make that argument. Of course, that would not really be the point. The point would be that, you are risking that, but also that's not a permanent condition. Meaning, obviously, that didn't last very long. Like a kind of integrated, working class co-opted form of capitalism only lasted a few decades. And of course, for people living in that time, that seemed like forever. And yet it wasn't forever, So what I always like to say is that no one on the left could foresee neoliberalism. None of them could foresee the 70s downturn. None of them could foresee that. They just thought, okay, we're...
Adorno couldn't?
Adorno couldn't. The Situationists couldn't. Marcuse couldn't. Right, they couldn't. The Trotskyists couldn't see that. The New Left couldn't see that. They couldn't see something worse than kind of co-opted social democratic conservatism. And it's like, actually, things can get a lot weirder than that. And the reason I say weirder and not worse is that it's pointless to say that neoliberalism is worse. Neoliberalism created possibilities that were not possible in the 3 glorious decades. Made things possible just generally, socially, culturally, politically, and therefore made the struggle for socialism possible in a way that might not
even economically.
Yeah,
even economically on the level of material wealth.
It freed things up. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a hard one because again, if you either have to see the mid 20th century as progress or you have to see it as regress in an undialectical way. Like the road to serfdom, whatever, administrative state, something like that. And it's like, well, actually that's the issue is that it's both, but it's also clearly politically regressive.
Yeah.
And, but its breakup was not taken advantage of, meaning the New Left should have taken advantage of the breakup of that form of capitalism, but they didn't. Instead, they did a rearguard action in the way that I'm concerned that the left is doing a rearguard action on neoliberalism now.
Trying to hold on to it.
Trying to hold on to it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it should be more obvious now why that is more, that should be clearer as a problem now.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think we've talked about this when I started Platypus. Some of my colleagues at the Art Institute were like, Chris Cutrone is trying to take the left back 50 years. And I was like, no, more like 80 years or more.
Yeah.
Right?
Like 100.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100 years. Yeah.
Right. But
more than that. 150 years. Why not? Keep going into the 19th century.
It could be into the 19th century, but they were concerned that I was out to liquidate the gains of the new left. And I was like, well, firstly, you can't undo history. And second of all, there were no gains. Not really.
And thirdly, you're not in a position to liquidate fucking anything.
Fucking anything. Except, of course, right. And that's why I'm John the Baptist and not Jesus. Yeah. But even Jesus didn't, ultimately, defeat the Pharisees. It took the Romans to destroy the Second Temple.
Right. And like right now, okay, if the welfare state apparatus, as it's understood through neoliberalism, which is totally, a different thing than what the Democrats are trying to go back to, or what it was, which are not the same anyway. If that's going to be dismantled, it's not going to be dismantled by some Marxist.
No.
It's going to be dismantled by
the
Trump and Elon Musk and Ramaswamy, and there's a lot of fear and fear-mongering around the Trump.
There's a Nation article that I read that was interesting. Maybe, was it the Nation? No, it might have been the Atlantic. So, okay, a little bit different. The Atlantic's more conservative. Where they were saying that, I forget who the writer was. They were saying that they wanted to see Elon and Vivek succeed. But they were afraid that they had the wrong model the wrong mental model for the problem. Right. But that otherwise, like, clearly, there is a lot of like government bureaucratic ossification, waste, and that it should be reformed. The problem is that they don't understand the nature of the problem to be reformed, and therefore, but it wasn't even like, they want to reform it in the wrong way. It was just like, yeah, it would be good to cut the budget of these things, all of it, but especially the defense budget, etc. Right? And so, I thought, okay, meaning it's pretty obvious that something's got to give, meaning that capitalism is not really functioning as best it could.
Right.
And therefore some changes need to be made. And so, and it's just as simple as that. And you could say that, of course, Reagan also took advantage of that crisis and did solve the problem insofar as getting capitalism pumping again. And that's all, that's the bottom line. I mean, that's all that there is, meaning, and it's not like, socialists should welcome that. Socialists have to deal with it. And stagnation.
Well, I think we should welcome it.
Yeah, we should welcome it. We should welcome it, especially because all the ways that the left has for doing things based on the past version of capitalism are going nowhere. That's a practical issue. That's a kind of a deep and rather opaque practical issue. That's why I always like to say that we need to figure out how things actually work.
Right.
Through practical exploration, especially in terms of like what's possible to be done. Right. At a more intellectual level, because I'm seen as the esoteric, abstract Marxist, and my contrarianism is not seen as practical, but as intellectual. That I'm doing a kind of a intellectual disservice or serving a kind of pernicious function intellectually on the left somehow. I don't know how this follows exactly. And I think it has to do with the fact that the left understands that they're involved in some kind of propagandistic battle of ideas kind of thing. And they realize that I might ruin that for them. It's kind of like when you were defending Horkheimer and Adorno against Lasordo with Daniel Tutt.
Right.
I could see his face kind of fall a little bit. I could see that he was like, oh, I'm actually not ready to stand by this Lasordo argument.
Right.
Because, you just demolished Lasordo. I mean, because Lasordo is just a liar.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I mean, so, love me or hate me, I'm not lying.
Right.
Marx wasn't lying. He might have been wrong, but he wasn't lying. Lenin wasn't lying. Adorno wasn't lying. Horkheimer's not lying. Trotsky didn't lie. He didn't.
Mm-hmm.
They could be wrong, but they weren't lying.
Right.
Lasordo lies. Rockhill lies. The Stalinists lie.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the bottom line. And they shouldn't have to lie if they're right. But they do lie.
Yeah.
So right or wrong, at least Marx, Lenin, Adorno, and Chris Cutrone were not lying.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I don't think it was a great accomplishment to demolish Lasordo at all. It just took knowing a bit about Horkheimer and Adorno and reading the Lasordo and going,
You could read them, though. You could read Horkheimer and Adorno in a way that maybe Daniel Tutt cannot, meaning you understand immanent critique, like you understand the point, right?
Right.
And I do feel like that's all I want from people is, and people have objected to me on this basis also, which is that it's safe. You can read Lenin. It's safe. It's safe. You can read Adorno. It's safe. Right? There's no ulterior motive. There's no hidden like racism or some shit. It's safe. It's all safe. Meaning you can trust. You can read. You can. You don't have to agree with it, but you're not being hoodwinked.
Right.
You're not being tricked. Meaning they could be wrong, but you're not being tricked. It's not a trick. And the thing with Rockhill and Lasordo is that they think Western Marxism is a trick. It's a CIA plot, for Christ's sake. It's a trick. And it's like, it's not a trick. Like, like the French fries. I'm no fan of the French fries, but I don't think they were lying.
No, I don't think so either.
Right?
I don't even think Althusser was lying.
No.
Who I really don't like very much now.
Yeah. I mean, he's right. Exactly. It's not a lie. I mean, meaning I think that they made a good faith effort, put forward arguments they sincerely agreed with, like believed in.
Yeah.
Like
they believed them. Yeah.
And you can learn from that.
My path towards Marxism started with Althusser because it was a weird thing because I wanted to go back to critical theory or philosophy and then to critical theory at a certain point in the early days of podcasting. And this guy on YouTube, a professor, had a little series of videos about Althusser, and I thought it was interesting. So I read some Althusser and I tried to understand Althusser. And as I did that, I thought, and I'm reading Marx at the same time, saying, this is impoverished in comparison to Marx.
Yeah, in comparison.
It doesn't, and he's leaving out impoverished in so much as he's leaving out quite a bit of the understanding that Marx develops through Adam Smith and Ricardo and people like that. So but if you read someone who's not lying but just wrong, you can learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can trust yourself. You can allow yourself to read these things. You're not going to be tricking yourself by reading these things. They're not tricking you. And, and I think that the hermeneutics of suspicion have gone too far, and they always started from a Stalinist place. Even though it was sort of anti-Stalinist, it's Stalinist. Like, there's a mental habit. It's that paranoia of the mid-20th century. This hermeneutics of suspicion and, what are people's real agenda and what's their actual social interest that they're expressing, and, this kind of shit. It's like, it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. One should understand context and background and, biography and, and you can glean something of a thinker's psychology from their work and from biographical knowledge that you might have of them. But, you know, the ideas do have a life of their own. And insofar as people have done actual intellectual work, the work that they've done is to actually have a foundation for these ideas established, meaning the what they wrote stands, you know? Now, again, it could be wrong, but it's not just a trick. It's not just a facade. It's not just a fancy way of saying something else that's much baser. You know, I mean, look, I know that I've got my hate watchers, right? And they're like, everything that Chris Cutrone says is just an apology for genocide of the Palestinians. You know, everything that Moishe Postone wrote about anti-Semitism on the left is just Zionism. And, you know, no.
Well, let's take a... I was going to try to bracket this part about bad faith and the hermeneutics of suspicion, but I'm not going to now because you've given me a way to talk about it. I think there is a case to be made that someone's motivations may push them in the direction of accepting arguments. And to put it differently, like someone like Hartfield, okay, and his stance on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think he sides with Israel in the conflict. You know, I don't think that he is for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, but I think he has ended up siding with Israel there. Okay. So I think his motivations are maybe a bit off. I don't know that, but I kind of suspect that. I interviewed him. I should release that interview. I kind of sat on it for a while. But nonetheless, I feel like, okay, before you can speak to the motivations, you have to first understand the argument and test out how sound it is.
Sure.
You can't, you know.
It would come down to the argument. In other words, the motivations still, you know, it could be a shoddy argument or it could be a strong argument.
Right. But people start from this position as if they're a psychiatrist dealing with a patient. Yeah. And the patient has come in and said, I've been contacted by aliens. And then they don't feel the need to discover whether or not that's true before addressing the underlying condition.
Or to examine what the aliens told them.
Well, they may do that. They will do that. But they'll do that from the context of what does that tell me about this person's childhood, or did they...
You know what I just thought of, Doug? I thought of, the prophet of Muhammad, all peace be unto him, transcribing the Quran from the, tellings that he received from Archangel Gabriel. And it's like, maybe it was a hallucination, maybe it was a bad trip, in the desert, but ultimately what matters is what he wrote.
Right. Okay, fair enough. But let's not go that one step deeper yet. I do understand what you're saying. Okay. I just want to say, let's put Hartfield's arguments about this on the level of I was contacted by aliens rather than what the aliens told him. Like that, Hartfield isn't communicating the gospel. He's just making an empirical claim. Okay, let's just pretend that that's...
But he's receiving bad information from alien class forces through the capitalist media.
Maybe, but you can't just know that. You have to You have to examine what he says and then try to compare it to some other sources and then make a judgment about what's
and the reasoning.
Right.
Yeah.
But people don't want to approach their politics like that. They want to take the role of the psychiatrist who can simply dismiss the initial claims, no matter what they are, and instead talk about the motivations of the person rather than what they're claiming, because they're taking the position of a cultural authority and an arbiter of reality. And they do that on the basis, I think, of thought taboos.
Yeah.
So they come in and you say something that is a thought taboo, and therefore it cannot be considered, and instead your motivations are what's examined. And I think if we could understand that much, then we would kind of get past this, and we could, because it isn't like the claim here is that people aren't motivated unconsciously in ways they're not aware of, or that there's not confirmation bias or what
Yeah,
have
like
you.
a
But
white working class person coming into a leftist meeting and saying, doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself, is going to be seen as someone who has a vested interest in white settler colonial ideology, both in America and in Israel-Palestine. And it's like,
right,
no,
okay.
it might just
Well,
be ill-informed. In other
or
words,
it could be that they do have
mm-hmm,
that,
mm-hmm,
but to some degree,
mm-hmm.
but also, wait a minute, in reality, in everyday life, in the world of politics today, nations do have the right to defend themselves.
And
It's like,
people don't like terrorism. Yeah, right.
right. And so like you have to say, okay, how do we understand reality, in these claims and not exclude some inherent racist project that may be way underneath informing his opinion. But on the other hand, like say, because the reverse of that is we all have our own pre-programmed ideology that's motivating our reasoning.
So there's a great deal of cynicism, and that's the thing. I think that people do treat other people like they are bad robots with wrong programming,
Right.
And, I mean, if that's the case, if it's just about who can flood the zone, with which form of the woke mind virus and which form of the dead brain worm, whatever, then then of course that's a recipe for violence.
Right.
Because then you just kill the carriers of the wrong ideas.
Yeah. And that's why you're a target, right?
That's why I'm a target. And if, you can virtually kill people, meaning you don't have to physically kill them in their body, but you can exclude them from society. Like you can, I don't know, like Spencer Leonard excluded from the Historical Materialism Conference in London by Sebastian Budgen. But
well,
of course,
how long has that been going on to Spencer? I would imagine that he's been excluded since that Ben Campbell letter. But is it?
Yeah, around that time. I think that we all spoke at the Historical Materialism Conference in Toronto, and Spencer did do a London Historical Materialism around 2014, 2013, around that time. And, so yeah, they can do that. They can do like polite form of killing. They can do a kind of a social assassination as opposed to a physical assassination. Mm-hmm. And certainly I've been, canceled, right? That's the term that we have for that now. Mm-hmm. We didn't have that term for a while before Me Too, but, we can be canceled. And, and I'm kind of pre-canceled, and, that can happen. But it does come down to thuggish behavior, meaning like there's no argument, there's no debate, there's just a anathematization. There's just a sort of, exiling or ban. Right. Mm-hmm. And, my attitude about that is, okay, I guess I understand why the left gets that way. And, they don't just do it to me, they do it to each other.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm not surprised that I fell victim to that. But there does seem to be, I'm a special case, meaning, I have put myself in a position where I could be canceled or banned by everybody on the left. Mm-hmm. In other words, that I don't take sides in the urgent divisions that they perceive, on the left, that everyone thinks is important, and that is itself objectionable. The fact that I don't line up, I don't join one camp or another camp, makes me objectionable to everyone. And that's not like a badge of honor or anything. It's just sort of like, okay, I guess so. Mm-hmm. Meaning, because it seems to be the other, so there's John the Baptist. There's also the child who says that the emperor is wearing no clothes.
Right.
And that's really what I've been. Mm-hmm. As far as the left is concerned. Because I think that ultimately I have never lost my innocence. Meaning I, read Marx and I thought, yeah, let's do this. Socialism, great. And then I realized pretty quickly, oh, these people are not about that.
Mm-hmm.
The emperor has no clothes. And, I just asked. I was like, what about the struggle for socialism? And it's like, wait, what are your motives in asking that question?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's like, it's an innocent question. It's remained an innocent question.
It doesn't matter whether it's innocent or not. It's a question that has to be contended with. You could come in as Charles Manson and ask, what about the struggle for socialism? And the question is valid, regardless of your motivations. That's what I was trying to point out.
No, I mean, hopefully one doesn't have to be a psychopathic killer and helter-skelter in order to ask the question sincerely, aren't we making this revolution?
Charles Manson never killed anyone.
That's a bad analogy because, of course, because I do think that people think that the damage I've done is maybe not my own doing, but the cult I've unleashed on the world.
Oh, well, this goes back to what you said at the beginning. The reason why you are particularly a target is because you did educate the young like Socrates, and now you have to drink the hemlock, Chris. I merely pretended to educate people on YouTube.
uh-huh. Man, drink the hemlock, yeah. Yep.
But I think you're not quite out of the woods, but I think you're headed towards the edge of the woods here on this. I don't know. Maybe I'm Pollyanna. I keep calling myself Pollyanna lately, but maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I feel as though right now there's more of an opportunity to start redefining what it is to be on the left, what it means to be a socialist than there was 2 months ago, or before the election. And because the symptoms are so freaking obvious right now, at least on Twitter.
Yeah.
The people who are, the way in which the rebels and mavericks, people like Dave Sirotto, he's kind of a maverick. He's a Bernie bro. He was on the outside of he was cast out. And the way the debate is coming down to who's going to be in charge of the Democratic Party. And he's like outright saying things like, why am I not making as much money as these people who
oh my goodness
lost the election?
Oh my goodness. Oh yeah.
Why am I not given more power in the party?
Right. So why aren't people listening to us? Well, I mean, I guess that's the other thing that I've realized also from a very young age is that nobody is going to listen to me. Meaning nobody who already has power now.
Right. Well, of course not. That's the whole thing about why the working class has to organize for itself is because the power, the political power, what is it that Marx says? The ruling ideology of any epoch is the ideology of the ruling class.
That's a nice tautology. That's right. In other words, it will tell you who the ruling class is. The people who believe that. That's true. Well, the ruling ideology, I mean, maybe that's the other thing that it takes people of our generation to understand, which is that the left in its oppositional ideas is part of the ruling ideology.
Right.
Right. Like, because, I think that we've seen, I feel like our entire lifetime has been, what we were talking about earlier about co-optation, like feminism, anti-racism, they've gone from being radical, marginal, insurgent ideas to becoming very much institutional ideas. Meaning, school.
They were almost there in the 90s.
I think they were there in the 80s. I mean, I think in my world in the Northeast, I think academia was completely identity politics oriented and, new social movement oriented. I always like to talk about I went to the gay community center in Greenwich Village as a teenager to the gay youth group, and I was subjected immediately to progressive stack, meaning all the women and all the people of color have to speak before a white man can speak.
Right.
And, and I just thought, what is this? And it was, it was an alternative space, but clearly it had millions of dollars behind it because it occupied real estate in Manhattan.
Right. Yeah.
Meaning to my mind, as a working class kid coming in from the suburbs, this was an institution.
And of course it was. You were right.
Yeah. And, not because I wanted to like burn it down or something, but, it was clear to me that my class betters, the people above me in the social hierarchy, had these ideas.
When I read Guy Debord when I was 21, 22 years old, the most dangerous idea I found there was the idea of the pseudo-left.
Yeah.
He would talk about.
The pseudo-left.
Yeah. Yep. And how he would claim, and it dominates the entire left. That would be the other thing that
Yep.
pointed at. And I felt like,
Stalinism, by the way.
So the pseudo-left was Stalinism.
Yeah, that was Stalinism. Yeah. Meaning, of course, it's Stalinism that is anti-oppression, not just anti-exploitation, all this stuff,
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so, because, it is that liquidation into liberalism and into radlibism. And I mean, liberalism meaning progressivism, progressive capitalism. Right. It's not like liberalism, because that's a confusion. It's progressive capitalism. And, what's progressive in capitalism, and that's what we need to be with.
Yeah, but when I read that and I kind of took it up, I was like, oh, this guy Guy Debord is kind of dangerous. Like, this guy maybe... Problems. I was a little scared just for having read it.
Yeah, because, if you start to agree with that, it's gonna again ruin your ability to be invited to the party.
Exactly. Right. But I did agree with it, and it did ruin my ability to get invited to the party. And yeah, so anyhow, I do understand why you are the last Marxist and why you're such a target now, better than I did at the beginning of the conversation, and why it's important for people to take you on directly rather than having someone else come in, which I tried to avoid with Tut, to represent your ideas and just to instead represent myself as I
of course, yeah,
understood it. Rather than having people debate you as if you are the dead Lacerdo, like you're already gone, you don't have to be dealt with, you're just directly, you can just be misrepresented in a 1,000 different ways. So that's not what we want to have happen. And so yeah, I understand that much better now. The question that remains though is, I guess, just how is it that you can let people understand? Because this is the other thing I've kind of finally, especially after talking to Reed, but also just in general, understand that if there was a Marxist project, and like if all these different sectarian groups were really holding on to Marxist socialism, they'd all sound like you. They would all sound like you. Maybe in slight variations and, of course, different styles.
No, it's true. Because if you, because a lot of the things that I say or I maintain, not original to me at all.
Right.
I mean, I might have a different way of putting it because it's 2024 and because, I speak a day English better than I you. Like, I don't know, but it's like, yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff would strike people, and that's why I think it's important. One of the things that we've done in Platypus that also, I think that we've been very transparent about what we're doing.
Right.
And one thing that we've said is taking the dying confessions of the left. And, what does that mean? It means we're interested in hosting the conversation to the point where everyone admits that they are not Marxists, that they disagree with Marx, where it's like, oh, yeah, Chris, I'm not a Marxist like you. I don't agree with that.
Caleb Maupin told me that directly. I mean, I loved it. Caleb Maupin was like, I think Stalin is a better theorist of capital than Marx.
Yeah.
Because Marx is a neurotic Jew. And
man. Yeah, no. It's very much like that. And, Daniel Tudd had Gerald Horn on. He was interviewing Gerald Horn, and Gerald Horn said, well, the Marxists believe that capitalism leads to socialism. But the problem with that is that they're cold to the human element.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's pretty clear. He's like, I don't want to be a Marxist if it means ignoring the suffering of people.
Right.
And, and that, the problem with the Marxists and with like the white left is that they think that capitalism leads to socialism, and they ignore the human element, and that's the enslaved, that's the black people.
Oppressed. That's the oppressed.
And,
right.
And it was very straightforward. And it's like, here's Gerald Hort saying he's not a Marxist.
Mm-hmm.
And you're somehow going to ignore that. Or you're going to say, well, the issue of racism somehow transcends Marxism.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, the answer to that is you can be a Marxist and in your political struggle not aim at overcoming the day-to-day humiliations and oppressions and injustice that you find in the world. And then also in the afternoon or on the weekend or whatever, go work in a local soup kitchen or make a donation to Greenpeace or NAACP.
Right. Absolutely,
like,
that's right.
Like, why are those things? People are multifaceted, and if you want to deal with the human element, you really want to deal with the human element, just go out and deal with it.
Be a liberal, be a Christian, be whatever. Be a charitable person. I mean, the other thing that struck me about it is that I felt like any right-winger can tell you that the Marxists, like scientific socialism, the cold approach to history, the ruthlessness of capitalism leading to socialism leaves out the human element. Any right-winger can tell you that that's what
Hayek would say that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's an economics.
Amari would say that.
Right.
That he doesn't agree with scientific socialism because it leaves out the human element.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, that's, maybe that's what we have to think about. In other words, that we have to think about it's not a matter of our feelings or our morality. It is a matter of objective historical processes.
Mm-hmm.
And, ultimately, that's going to be decisive. And that therefore, doesn't cancel our morality or our feelings, but it situates them.
Right.
And, morality and feelings can justify any politics. Everybody thinks they're morally in the right.
Right. Everyone feels that they are.
Feels that they are.
I mean,
yeah.
Sometimes in our better moments, we feel that we're not. And we...
are self-critical.
Guilt. Yeah, and we have guilt and shame and...
But even then, one is faced with the idea that maybe you feel guilt about things, but you feel like they can't be changed.
That's shame.
Right.
Shame, I think of it, shame is like you turn it around into a self-critique of your essence. Like, I'm a bad person rather than I did a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, what if you're not a bad person, or you had to do a bad thing because the world is the way it is and the world can't be changed?
Then I think you would become a sociopath. You would stop feeling shame or guilt at that point.
No, it's bourgeois coldness. It's bourgeois coldness. It's what
okay, all right. About. No, if you think the world can't be changed, that's not just bourgeois coldness. That's sociopath.
Oh, well, that would be true. Like meaning, yeah. Right, not in some fundamental way, but rather, no, that would be right. The cynicism, that would be something else. No, like a reasoned position of, I have to do what's necessary. I can't change things. I have to turn a blind eye. I have to keep my head down. I have to ignore things in order to survive.
Right. But not only in order to survive, but in order to survive, in order to find a way to help make change. Not that the change can't be tomorrow. It can't be, I can't just flip a switch and make things right. But I have to hold on to my understanding of how things should go or how we can make the world better without expecting it to be immediate and ready at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what's driven the left a little bit crazy, which is that, like the labor aristocracy or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, actually the working class in the United States and in Europe and Japan and other advanced countries. I mean, at this point, a large portion of the working class in China doesn't have to sacrifice anything for us to achieve socialism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in other words, they might have to sacrifice their free time and maybe ultimately their lives in social political struggle and revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have to engage in some kind of altruistic self-sacrifice.
Right.
They do not. In other words, they have to sacrifice themselves to the cause, not to the wretched of the earth.
Right.
You know, very different. And, you know, so I think that that's the thing that, you know, at the end of the day, I think that it's hard for, and it's a very middle class thing. You know, the right is quick to point this out.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that, you know, it's very convenient for middle class types to condemn the selfishness of the working class.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right? And yet that's what we will hear. Like, you know, like Gerald Horne said, the paid sector of the working class, he said this to Daniel Tutt, the paid sector of the working class
Mm-hmm.
is by virtue of being paid, class collaborationist. Again,
That is such a dead end. I mean, I don't
in substance, it's completely un-Marxist.
Totally.
Right?
Right.
And so not only did he declare that he's opposed to Marxism theoretically, but also in substance, his understanding of things is completely contrary to Marxism.
But even if you throw the Marxism away, you don't even require him to be a Marxist. Just be a progressive. It is insane. Because what you're saying is that the only good people in society are those who are suffering the most. And anyone who managed to live a halfway decent life and therefore have the ability to do things politically are not to be trusted. So
it reminded me...
It's Afro-pessimism, I think.
It is a kind of Afro-pessimism, it is. And, you know, and that's all well and good for a tenured professor.
Right. No, look, why don't you write some fucking novels? Like, why be political?
No,
paint a painting.
He is writing novels. It's called History.
Mm.
And, you know, it reminded me, I think that I've mentioned this on the podcast previously, perhaps. It reminded me of when I had largely black coworkers, including workers who were living in the projects.
Mm.
And having a job was white. Having a job made white.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, you know, and because that's what it comes down to. You know, it's like having a job means you're selling out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, how marginal do you have to be? And of course there's like lumpen marginality, there's anarcho, like subcultural stuff where middle class runaway kids or whatever might think that to have a job is to sell out. But when you're dealing with like poor people, it does have a different pathos to it.
But you know, I think there's another dream that you can have, and not just being marginal. If you hold that position, you don't need a job. You just need to become a star.
Yeah,
or
ghetto fabulous,
or be the mob boss.
Yeah,
and you can live in a mansion and be surrounded by opulence.
Absolutely,
but you don't have a job, so you're not white.
You're not working for the man.
Right.
Not working for the man. And that's what it came down to. And I was like, okay, you know, so one of the horrors that we have to reckon with of, you know, legacy of the 20th century is that Marxism was such a powerful ideology in the world, had such a kind of elan to it, had such a reputation that everybody wanted to be a Marxist. Everyone wanted to justify their politics via Marxism. And so, you know, Gerald Horne does think of himself as some kind of a Marxist, but that's just a weird abomination of history. Meaning, if he was honest with himself, he would realize he's not a Marxist, but he feels like he has to claim that in order to be intellectually respectable. And, you know, he'd be much better off if he were a black nationalist who thought that Marxism is a white settler colonial ideology.
Right.
Which he basically does, right? So it becomes like black Marxism versus white Marxism. But I just wish people would just drop the Marxism. Like, in other words, I really do want everyone to drop the Marxist pretense and just be what they are.
Did I ever tell you about the time that I interviewed the former head of the NEA, who was a friend of John Podesta's? I've forgotten his name now, but it was after the WikiLeaks email drop, and I emailed him, and he came on to discuss what the real meaning of his email to Podesta was and how we should interpret it. And I said to him, you're on a Marxist podcast. I consider myself kind of Marxist. And he said, oh, I do too.
Right.
And I said to him, no, you're not.
You really don't. Yeah, you really don't. No, I mean, and but again, I think that for the lay people in our audience, they're going to be like, who are Chris and Doug to say who's a Marxist and who's not? And it's just like, again, this is where I come back to you don't need Marxism for that. You don't need to be a Marxist for what you want to do. And so, it's not going to serve. And, and Marxism should challenge us. In other words, we shouldn't be rifling through Marx to find the things that we want Marx to say. We shouldn't be reading Lenin for, affirmation.
Right.
We should be reading these people, or Adorno for that matter, and they should offend us, meaning they should rub us the wrong way. It should be like, wait, what? I don't agree with that. It should be like that, because I think that otherwise we distort it and we just read what we want to read into it. Right.
I totally agree. What I want to do next is record a conversation just about current events and the stuff that's going on.
Yep.
But I will just say that I do think you are, in fact, one of the last Marxists. I would give Spencer Leonard a similar designation, and a few others maybe who aren't even part of Platypus. Who knows? We might find some, but I do think that, and the dialectical turn here that you've made, which I think is worth considering maybe in a future podcast, is how the task of Marxism is to put Marxism aside for a while.
Yeah.
That one doesn't sit right easily in my mind, right? But I think it may be true. So we'll talk about that in the future. But thanks for doing this again, Chris. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.